Thanks for the paper. It's really interesting, and I think 3 really different perspectives on the intelligent city. My question is building on Simon's talk, when I think it's really for everyone, is, so I was just looking this up. The etymology of intelligent is intelligere, which is between choice, so between choosing, so to choose between. And that raises this interesting provocation for me, which is, how can we choose between possible intelligent city futures? So I guess what I'd like to ask is how if you ask me words of advice of what standardized future should I promise just now in this talk, and maybe advice on how to avoid the intelligent city becoming like the Orwellian city, for example.
Great question. And just tell me, I think I'll take a couple at once.
Right. Well, I had a bit of a comment and a question. The comment is based on 2 assumptions, really. The idea of intelligence is incredibly contested and incredibly complex for psychologists and cognitive scientists. I come from a department of psychology, behavioral and cognitive science, and anyone who is working on artificial intelligence will tell you that these are incredibly brittle systems that can nowhere get near human intelligence, because human intelligence depends on biological and social systems, which these machines cannot. We would need an incredibly disruptive technology, which is nowhere to be seen, to approach anything that relates to intelligence. So, given that, I think we get back to the point that was made by the last paper. What is exactly that the models offered by the technologies we have at hand today impose in the way of thinking and imagining the urban? And that's what I would like to ask the panel, and especially the colleague who was talking about modeling, because I would like to understand what are the assumptions, what are the conceptions, what are the variables that are behind modeling an intelligent future for a city. That's a concern that for me becomes very, very clear when we simplify the imagining of urban futures through a model of intelligence that is only based on a very limited capability we have today to replicate something like human intelligence.
Good question. Do you want to take it, or do you want a second? No, I can take it. I mean, I think I find it very difficult actually to talk in huge generalities, but I think one of my key points about the modelling, the opportunity for modelling, is that up till now, much of the smart city type of work has been, one of the critiques is that it has been largely descriptive with a huge reliance on visualization, right? And so there's an opportunity for modelling to go beyond that and to take into account a broader range of understandings of processes. But we do need to be very careful, because implicitly in building a model, you're building in, not only are you constraining yourself to describing a limited number of processes, let's say, one doesn't try. I mean, this is somewhat of a debate, right? There are some people who would argue that maximalist type models, an agent-based model is an example, where you can have almost a city of agents making decisions, and that's a very complicated model with a huge number of parameters and a huge amount of unseen human decisions almost in its making, right? And so I think that case is quite relevant to your question. The kind of model that I was talking about in my talk is actually a very minimalist type of model that tries to capture a very specific process, a very specific constraint that we believe is important for development, and it explicitly doesn't try to capture everything that's going on in the city. And so I actually personally believe that this minimalist approach to modelling is actually a better tool for policy, because it's much clearer what's going in there and what it does and doesn't try to include. One of the problems with the maximalist system of systems kind of viewpoint of modelling is that there are so many things in there that it does try to, in a sense, rival human thinking.
It tries to become
and I personally would agree that's very problematic, but that isn't a view that's held necessarily very broadly within this community.
That's great. And on the other thing about standardisation, you'll pass to the others.
You can.
Yeah. So in response to the first question, I think that choice is critical, kind of in all the debates that we've heard today. There's the haves and the have-nots, the choice and the lack of choice. But I think, relative to this issue, I think that humans have the capacity to both subvert it and kind of cock it up, or ensure that your talk, the content, the quality of the intelligent support system or technology actually is pretty limited, which kind of is reflected in your comment about the ability to achieve, human-based artificial intelligence. However, I think it is a direction of travel. I don't think we quite know where it's going to end up or how quickly, but it is happening. And I was going to have, I didn't even think to begin to explore what an intelligent city really was. It was just a title for this session, and I was frankly coming from another place, but like you, I think it's really something that needs to be revisited quite urgently. And I was going to have a section all about, and someone mentioned it earlier, the kind of the learnings from science fiction. And I think, we know all the movies, Matrix, Transcendence, Terminator, Blade Runner, Brazil. It's really fascinating, actually, whether you're interested in those or not, but you actually see those and others, 1984 from a different perspective, how actually they become incredible reference points for things which have already started to come true, are coming true, will come true, but we don't know quite when. And I think to answer your question, I think, I'm no expert within the singularity, but this notion that the computer has the potential to become biological, maybe that's not so far away. I'm guessing there's people within our university and others that are working on cellular-based, quantum-based computers which are not silicon-based, and Intel will probably go out of business and someone else is going to come into business. And I think that, that rate of exchange, I was doing some web searching for this, and I came across some work that these guys in the States were doing, molding, in effect, computer networks into people's brain, initially in order to support a health issue, a problem of connection, but actually the enhancement possibilities of the human brain that has huge capacity currently, but actually doesn't necessarily operate in the ways that a computer can enhance it. I was going to have another section, this is the last bit I'll say, but on how, certainly from a designer's perspective, I've seen, I've worked from a drawing board into computers, into 3D modeling, into 4D modeling, virtual reality, augmented reality, etc. And I've started to, I think someone coined the phrase before me, but virtual reality has become real virtuality, if that means anything. But what's happening is I think this migration into a potential world that I was trying to explain around a cyber realm, an avatar. I see my son who is in multi-dimensions in the same room as me, connected with friends who he knows, people he doesn't know, through an avatar, expressing business as a 15-year-old, trading. He's in an emerging market that I'm not sure we quite understand yet, and I'm no kind of intelligence expert or anything like that. But I think from a social, urban, city-based perspective, there's something going on here which I'm not sure we're quite comprehending. But it'd be nice to explore, and I'm not sure whether that's making any sense. But
yeah, it is. Thinking of the just that simple point about the technology from sort of pen and paper through to virtual reality and back again. It's interesting then that the maps and plans, so the Oxcam kind of imaginary, I'm always interested in the lack of those technologies for spatial planning, which is obviously my background. And wouldn't it be marvellous if you could, we all do spatial planning from the same maps that they've been doing them from since the 18th century. Some of these technologies must be usable. I mean, there are some people that have used Minecraft for city planning, but certainly in terms of that strategic kind of level, imagination of a physical future, I find that quite intriguing, the difference between exactly from paper back. Sorry, Sam, left straight on you, so you'd like to say something about standardisation and...
You kind of have to shout into it.
Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, thank you. I mean, the first question about options is quite interesting, because I think what concerns me about the sort of the rhetoric of the intelligent city as a way of sort of defining the merits of a particular urban context is the way in which the criteria are increasingly caught up in metrics for city, for doing city ranking, for example. So the way in which smart city ranking encourages a particular commitment to a form of decision making. The way in which some of the world cities data is quite interesting, because one of the indicators, we did a paper with a colleague in City about these world city standards, and one of the indicators is measures waste collection, but it only measures formal waste collection, not informal waste collection. So the indicators that are being solidified within the standards themselves don't even measure what they claim to be measuring, which is one of the paradoxes, which doesn't appear to be very intelligent, does it, as a way of organising a data system. So I think the thing that concerns me about this is this is about a way of imposing a particular, I suppose it's a particular way of knowing the urban, which squeezes out other sorts of questions as they become increasingly caught up in forms of calculation and measurement. The second question, I think, it's very interesting, because this getting interested in this takes, as an urbanist, takes you into areas that don't really have expertise in. But with colleagues in the Urban Institute, we've been trying to understand automation, and we've been reading outside of traditional urban studies around aviation and manufacturing, areas that have tried to automate and withdraw human agency. And the storyline's actually really very interesting. All of the experiences are that you actually have to bring human agency back into decision making. So these systems impose a sort of transactional mechanics, and actually the transactional mechanics is too rigid. It doesn't allow for the importance of critical reflection on what's really happening in the urban context. And there's a very nice example in the Rio control room, where they'd automated a set of processes to deal with emergencies, and then had to unstitch all the software and put people back into the process. So it might be that we need to start looking outside of traditional urban studies to get an understanding of what some of the contradictions and limits are of these sorts of automated processes, what their material consequences are as well. I agree, but I think it's quite a challenging agenda for us as urbanists to start doing that.
Yeah, and a quick plug for the workshop we had at Sheffield, Urban Automation, that really did challenge some of those models and thinking. I'm going to go back for more. I've got Sue and Eric. Oh my word, right, okay. Everybody's piling on me. But before I do that, I would just like to have a small moan. Agent-based modelling, that was the worst review of a paper of mine I ever had. I was doing a nice little SNA of different styles of governance, and somebody wrote this big thing about agent-based modelling. I had to look at what it was, not why the paper had been rejected because it was an agent-based modelling approach. How annoying. Right, Sue.
Well, my question may reveal as much ignorance. No, I wanted to ask across all of you about the relationship, if there is any, between lawyers and the kinds of people who are doing the current codification. In other words, you've got a set of kind of computer scientists, engineers, who come out of a very particular tradition, and whether it's your East Vent or anything else, they're embedding a codified way of thinking and operating the city. And I wonder what relationship it has to the past, where at least in my imagination, that role was played by lawyers.
Lawyers.
Standards, regulations, is that not the fiscal codes? Is there a relationship between these two things?
No idea relative to the coding of the software and the tools, but in terms of how they're then applied, I guess I have a better knowledge of that, but I don't know how that's embedded in code. It's not my arena.
The smart city standardisation process that was alluded to was it's not a legal process. That's a sort of, it's almost like a consensus finding process where they pulled together some technologists mainly and a couple of ethicists to come up with these, and it's a very, very interesting question, right? So some of the people that were So the Future Cities Catapult were heavily engaged because of the notion that that has got a link to new products and services, and all the logics that were flying around seemed extremely of a type. It's very odd stuff, but it's certainly not legalistic in that sense. It's sort of other, I think.
Is there something behind your question that I didn't hear?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I think so one of the things lawyers are deeply problematic as a profession, but one of the things which is good about them is that there's a strong ethos of ethics, which is associated with it. And I wonder to what extent that is embedded in some of the new thinking about an intelligent city, a smart city, and all of those things. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, I'm wondering about precedent and continuity. And when it comes to a moment of contesting the spaces which are being built, which at the moment are kind of utopian, imaginary, innovative, but when those begin to be contested, what codes will we depend on to arbitrate those contestations?
Good question.
Can we get a few more? Because otherwise I'm going to just take a few
Yeah.
more. Is that okay? There's a whole line of you here, but all want to ask a question. So, Catherine
Okay.
first.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question.
I'll be very quick. It's mainly for Neve, and I was very interested in what you said about the database in Medellin. And it also made me think, knowing a little bit about Medellin, about the really large informal economy. Now, you've already said about this sort of minimalist, maximalist type of thing, and I get that. And I also think that it's really interesting that you will have that ability to do this predictive modelling. But I wondered, firstly, where all that, and Medellin's known as the sort of city of small-scale entrepreneurs, and are they included in thinking about the labour market in this intelligent way, or are they excluded? And then it also got me thinking about what about the emotional labour, or say even paid productive labour, which goes in terms of allowing the city, the intelligent city to function. I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, take it.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. There were a couple of different strands of research kind of knitted into one thing in the talk, so I didn't get to go into as much detail as I would have liked on this sort of issue of formality, informality. So actually, essentially, what happened was that we developed this collaboration with Bancodex, the development bank in Colombia, and we were given access to microdata on formal workers across the whole country. And in the course of that exploratory work, building this online tool, we did realise that actually there was a huge variation across cities in the level of formality, which was very unexpected and something that hadn't been really seen in the literature before. And we defined formality as the proportion of people from the working age population who are in formal employment. And so it ranges from as low as less than 10% to about 15-20% in Colombia. So actually, roughly across the country, about 80% of the workforce, because there is no social security, payments, are doing something, and we don't know what, right? And so our model here was actually, the work that this is based on seeks to predict the growth of the formal sector based on this embedded knowledge idea. But having said that, new work, which we're actually embarking on with many people in this room, actually, this PEAK project, seeks to capture the informal economic activities in firms using imagery data. So it's actually a completely new endeavour to capture this entirely missing segment of the economy that we don't actually really know much about, beyond surveys that really don't cover very much. So, yeah,
Thank you.
So Igor and Eric together. That's
Oh,
okay.
did you answer that?
I think we can come back. I thought there was not specific. Do you want to?
Just a short response back on the legal thing, which I'm with you on the lawyers, but I mean, my understanding kind of in smart city context and urban context, it tends to be about equity and equality and fairness and trust, and the issue around smart is more kind of certification around performance or sustainability and those kind of issues, and you kind of flip over into the legal aspects when you sort of move into the more human rights perspective. So maybe we've stumbled across a place where actually lawyers can be excluded, which would be fantastic. And then if we can use automation to actually take away many aspects of their role, right?
It's a utopian thought.
Yeah, and then we can debunk the myth that they have any use whatsoever. They disappear in a little JPEG that I had up there that didn't run.
But the thing is, in a smaller city, they might represent a certain kind of codified knowledge which isn't the code. I guess that's a metaphor, isn't it? Igor and Eric, you've been dying.
Just building on this pragmatic fashion and avoiding a little bit the dystopic critique to the smart city. That is, I think, I consider this necessary, but sometimes it's counterproductive coming from the academia. By the way, my question is, and maybe just building on this idea of informality and formality in cities, are there alternative business and social models in cities that could just overcome the algorithmic disruption? I'm thinking about yesterday, the keynote mentioned Barcelona with the Airbnb battle. So I'm thinking about how cities like Medellin or others, they can take advantage of the informality, of the pentahelix, by the way, and bring that with this perspective, in order to suggest alternatives in business and social models in cities. I didn't mention just business models. I mentioned business and social models.
We're trying to embed a research project in the potential co-design of the development of the innovation district in order to try and kind of look at things like that. And one of the things, we don't quite know where we're going yet, but one of the thoughts we had was that actually this coalescence of data around the individual who becomes this mobility, where we're kind of taking data from people all the time to understand how cities are functioning relative to the people, is a piece that I think is critical in that. So.
Can I just add one thing? So I'm going to answer the question from a slightly different perspective. So if we think about sort of the economic prosperity of cities being connected to their ability to do complex things, right? To essentially firms, under some kind of perspectives, firms exist in a sense to coordinate people of different specialisms, and it's combining people with these different specialisms that enables them to do complex things, which are sort of the source of higher incomes, etc. But the argument with these new sort of gig economy, online kind of labour is that actually there's the possibility through these new mechanisms to create employment that is on the one hand formal, because it coordinates different people of specialisms in large organisations, but it's on the other hand informal, right? Because it has a lot of attributes of informality and people essentially work for themselves, etc. And so that there's this sort of this meeting of the formal and informal in very much in new ways, and that's something that's an emerging research interest. I have a collaboration with the Internet Institute to look at online labour, but it's equally true of these different sort of gig economy routes. So I think that's a very interesting question, where you have these meetings of traditionally very separate types of work in this sort of new form.
Gosh, that's so interesting. Everybody's racking their brains for their theory of the firm in Sociology 101, aren't you, as undergraduates? Eric, please.
When I read all the stuff about the intelligent city, what always strikes me as an urban scholar is the unexamined and implicit assumption that underlies most of it, and which goes very much against my own idea of what a city is. And the unexamined assumption is that the city exists, that there is a thing called the city, and in a kind of anthropomorphic way acts in a variety of ways. In the old days we did it with the mechanical systems theory. Today we're much smarter. We use complexity theory with indeterministic feedback loops, open-endedness, etc. But nonetheless, it is like a sophisticated complex automaton that doesn't work well, but that if we use the right intelligent, smart coding, we can make that thing together so that the city, an existing thing, can act as a coherent subject. Now, this is radically at odds with what many urban scholars, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, would think the city is, which basically is that the city does not exist. That the name we put on this thing is a radically heterogeneous constellation of all manner of things and people that do not hang together, occasionally do, occasionally do not do, and that precisely defines what the urban is all about, the radical heterogeneity, contestability, disagreements, etc. And not a kind of failing, complex, anthropomorphic thing that does all sorts of things. A city does not do anything, does not exist as such. And that is a radically different assumption of what the urban is all about compared to one that thinks the city exists and acts. And you hear continuously in that kind of literature, the city does this, the city does not do that, the city is a problem there, and I think, who the hell is the city? It does not exist.
And that's very prevalent even within social science, as
Neve
points out. You know, to see and to know the city, then there's a sense of subjectification in a way.
Yeah.
Well, you knew we were going to get ontological in the end, right? Professor, you first.
There's a large part of the logic of the intelligent city is to constitute. The logic is to try to create the imaginary that the city is knowable as an entire entity. So across, and this is a very old idea. I mean, they've rediscovered the urban metabolism and the notion of urban cybernetics, and that sort of, and it's an attempt to make a claim that it is possible to know the city as an entity. But the reality is actually very different. The reality is that they can't even find an entity to purchase one of these very large integrated software packages because of fragmentation, because of privatisation, public-private partnerships, because of liberalisation. So what's actually happened is that increasingly the software and the intelligent cities sector has had to, in a sense, fragment the sort of integrated system. What you find is that these sorts of packages have become fragmented into much more discrete platforms, sensing platforms, predictive analytic platforms, urban data platforms. So you can see the way in which for themselves they've had to, in a sense, respond to the fact that this imaginary doesn't exist. And they've had to find another way in which they can cut up the software package, which is effectively what they've done, into a series of modules, and to try and find different entry points into this $2.47 trillion market. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating what they've had to do.
I totally agree with you, and to jump on the bandwagon, it's not the city, it's a society, isn't it? So,
now, it's a society that does offer another way to do civic cybernetics through using social networks coming from a completely different tradition around collective social imagining, which ends you up in social networks. And that's what I was kind of thinking. A lot of this is underpinned by, do you view the city as tending towards order or tending towards entropy in a sense? And in network theory, you have hubs and spokes. You gather everyone together, and you create small cliques which are like small worlds. And then, if that develops as you might hope, your small worlds can kind of cope with one another, and the cliques, which is kind of the model for dispersal. So, like Al Qaeda, a centerless network. And I think the urban's much more like that. So I can see the technological metaphors as quite helpful because it tends towards disaggregation, right? In which case it isn't a problem to know or to govern the city because you've got a disaggregated subject, and that does fit with kind of automation and with modularization of and I mean, this is always the story, is that the IBM Smart City Box never found a single client because it was trying to quite literally put into a box what it was possible to know, and that sort of dashboard mentality doesn't fit with how you run or are in a city. Sorry, I'm going to rant there. Nick, do you want to come back in? Has anybody else got more things to say? Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So the notion of the smart cities and intelligent cities has always provoked a negative reaction on me. So I'm always wondering, what do I know about the ICT world and the way ICT specialists are looking at this, particularly thinking about Simon's comments about learning from other fields and so on. And one sense I have from a certain group of ICT colleagues that I have is that they are not so interested in the Ciscos of the world or the big projects, but rather they are looking at decentralized and distributed intelligence. And I think for me, that is a completely different logic that we have to engage with critically. I'm not saying that that kind of intelligent city distributed, which by the way, since Barcelona is mentioned, it's also very popular in Barcelona. I'm not sure that's in itself a positive development. I think it's a very different form of understanding the intelligent city, which is not necessarily served by this critique, because this critique is looking at the more cybernetic model of a smart city. So when I hear about blockchains, for example, I wonder what kind of social critique is going to respond to that. So that would be my question.
Are you keen to get in amongst that now?
No, just, I mean, in presenting, I don't believe in the smart city or the intelligent city. I think it's just a kind of a useful debate that we've had there, and I think it's much more akin to a dispersed, disaggregated.
Well, you might not believe in it, but it might believe in you. I mean, some of those spatial imaginaries that you're putting at the beginning, these are powerful. And as I say, Oxcam, it is fascinating to me how, when you're working with the grain of the market, you can create a whole new spatial imaginary almost.
Well, what I meant was as a one-dimensional approach. Kind of,
yeah.
It's the intelligent city or nothing.
But also, if you're working against market forces, you can have a spatial imaginary that you've been trying to develop for 40 or 100 years. I mean, so the contrast between Oxcam, which literally emerged in a week, and, for example, the connectivity of the E20 line, as in Hull, Liverpool, all the way across the middle of the top, because that's a counter-market set of spatial imaginaries that it's very difficult to kind of animate, whereas Oxcam, people in no-code Go are just rushing around like it's going to solve everything. Nick, sorry.
Sorry, just to quickly go back to the Eric Simon thing. Well, I kind of wholeheartedly endorse what you're saying. I think the kind of small elephant that's rapidly growing in the room is sidewalk labs. So the city of Toronto, the municipality of Toronto is ceded an enormous chunk of its city to Google Alphabet. This is the kind of secession that goes way beyond gated community, right? It's a secession that is statutory and is also informational, right? But it's like they're ceding all the people that live in this will give all their information basically to a corporation. So I don't know. I mean, it's not really a question, but to me, I see this as a claim by Google to be able to define what a city is. Like they will be able to control the word.
And it isn't just that; it's Belmont as well, because that's the Microsoft that's not even built yet. And some of those technologies combining, like sort of Manstar City, those kinds of things, combining in a kind of proper city like Toronto, that sidewalk project is fascinating. And they are not shy about advertising what they think it is. It's a reinvention of the urban, and it's a reinvention of the urban subject. What do you think?
I have to say I'm not an urbanist. I'm very new to this community, and all of these concepts are actually quite new to me. And so I actually struggle to talk in such generalities about what a city is and what it means, to think of something as a city or not a city. I think I have sort of a reasonably in-depth knowledge of how economists see cities, but I find it difficult to kind of talk about a city across every possible domain as a sort of single entity, both from a modelling perspective, but also just from a conceptual perspective. So I feel like I need to actually spend some more time.
You're in the right place. Speaking of which, so the project that's seeking to bring all this together is the PI is Michael. So do you want to say something, Michael?
I don't know whether it's possible to wrap up by going back to Simon's myths. I was listening to Lord Lawson the other day, who was talking about the myth of climate change and the story about the myth of the way in which the tobacco industry propagated the myths of ill health. So I guess there are myths that can be broken, right, as well as myths that might actually turn out to be true. So I guess if you went back to your myths, your 5 myths, I don't know whether I'm putting them on the wall. I mean, I slightly disagree with Eric in the sense that I think the city exists because it's brought into existence by techniques, tools, trades, right? So political entity. I don't think we disagree. It is conjured up. One of the ways it's conjured up is through various various ways in which aggregation is made visible through data, which is part of what we. I think it's not a disagreement, but a disagreement is an agreement in a way. But if you then assume that it's conjured up through data, I just wonder whether any of the panel would think that any of the myths are redeemable. But it's only as a way of kind of wrapping up a very interesting presentation.
Yeah, so mythiest myth. Anybody?
I mean, I'm an eternal optimist, so I enjoy, the potential future where, technology and humans kind of combine for the benefit of society. So, call me naive or ignorant, but I mean, I think there's a level of free will in humanity, regardless of sort of oppression and the cyber policeman and that kind of stuff. That means there'll be a continual tension, and we don't know what that future holds compared to some of the sci-fi that we've seen. But I'm an optimist that we'll work together on it. Who knows?
I'm quite pessimistic.
It's not necessarily a good thing if they're related.
Well,
we're going to get to synthesis in a moment. It's going to be amazing.
I suppose the issue is how to unblack box the new black box. That's what I'm interested in. I am interested in alternatives. A couple of questioners have asked about what's alternatives. I used to think it might be in the civic hacking community, but actually I realised civic hacking is actually part of this formal response. It's not actually, it's the same computational logic, and it's just more informal sweated labour that tests and develops new computational products. I'm worried that actually the same sets of social interests will get interested in blockchain and other sorts of supposedly, they can do whatever they like, they can do whatever they like, they can do something that looks alternative but isn't. I mean, Google can experiment with, is it Toronto? And the vision, their vision is like, cities produce lots of data. How can we monetize that in a standardised product? That's what I think that's probably what they're experimenting with in there. But I think lawyers have a role, actually. I think Sue's question, in the US, it's in this sort of civil rights movement to trying to contest these automated welfare products and trying to expose the assumptions behind automated processes of checking whether people are entitled to benefits. There's all sorts of work going on there involving lawyers. It's really important to try to show what sits behind these computational systems that just produce answers that are really problematic in terms of what they do to people. So I think it's how do we contest the logic? I think it's a really important question, and it's seen as progressive. I've done gentler versions of this talk in ICT smart conferences, and I get lynched for doing this. And I know I'm slightly overstating some of this, but still think somebody at Future Cities said we're not interested in the previous experience of using digital technologies. They're not interested. It's like eradication of history. There's nothing we can learn from this.
They call it idiots.
Yeah. This is the
So.
I'll stop.
Yeah, Simon will talk about this all night. So we've got a techno optimist. We have I don't know, an ex-optimist.
Yeah,
One of the levelers movement smashing the clouds. I promised that we would resolve civic cybernetics and their spatial imaginaries in this interesting talk. How do you think we've done, Neve?
There are many questions to be discussed.
Very good. And in that light, I definitely recommend that you look at the new website for the Peak project, because that is deliberately trying to combine different kinds of urban intelligence. Michael Allen is the project manager, and Michael at the back is the principal investigator. I've had an absolutely lovely hour. I think it's been completely illuminating, and it's been a highlight of my day, week, month, year.